Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now. The morning sun filtered through the elegant windows of Ashford Estate with that particular quality of light that only an English spring can provide, casting gentle shadows across the well-appointed drawing-room where Miss Jane Marple sat with her customary composure. She had accepted Lady Ashford's invitation to view the famous conservatory with a mixture of curiosity and mild apprehension, for in her considerable experience gatherings centered around remarkable achievements often proved to be anything but ordinary. "You simply must see Dr. Hartwell's extraordinary creation," Lady Ashford had insisted over tea the previous afternoon, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm that struck Miss Marple as perhaps a touch theatrical. "A green rose, my dear Miss Marple. Truly green, not merely tinged with yellow as one might expect, but the most remarkable emerald shade you could possibly imagine." Miss Marple had smiled politely and murmured appropriate words of interest, though privately she reflected that in her long experience, nature's own palette was quite sufficient for her modest tastes. Still, scientific achievement was always worthy of admiration, and she had known many dedicated gardeners whose passion for their work was both touching and admirable. Now, as she waited with the other select guests in the morning room, Miss Marple observed her fellow invitees with a gentle attention that had served her so well over the years. There was something in the atmosphere, a tension that reminded her rather unpleasantly of the time when Mrs. Weatherby had announced her intention to reveal which of her neighbours had been pilfering from her prize-winning vegetable garden. Dr. Edmund Hartwell himself stood near the French doors leading to the conservatory, a man of perhaps 60 years with the intense demeanour of one who had devoted his life to scholarly pursuits. His hands, Miss Marple noted, bore the telltale stains of one who worked extensively with plant materials, and he possessed that particular restlessness of manner that suggested either great excitement or considerable anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen, Doctor," Hartwell began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled group, "what I'm about to show you represents the culmination of 15 years of dedicated research into the fundamental nature of plant pigmentation." Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a young woman standing somewhat apart from the others, introduced earlier as Miss Pemberton, Doctor, Hartwell's research assistant. There was something in the girl's manner that struck Miss Marple as oddly watchful, reminiscent of young Sarah Bunting back in St. Mary Mead, who had always seemed to be observing rather than participating in village life until that unfortunate business with the missing church funds. Professor Blackwood, a distinguished gentleman with a carefully groomed beard, listened with what appeared to be polite attention, though Miss Marple detected a certain tightness around his eyes that suggested feelings held firmly in check. She had seen that expression before, most memorably on the face of Colonel Weatherby when his rival had won the annual rose competition 3 years running. Mrs. Fairfax, an elegantly dressed woman whose jewellery spoke of considerable wealth, stood with the practised poise of one accustomed to exclusive gatherings, yet her gaze remained fixed upon Dr. Hartwell with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to mere scientific curiosity. Miss Marple was reminded of Mrs. Hartwell's expression when eyeing a particularly fine piece of spode at the church jumble sale. The estate's head gardener, Mr. Fletcher, lingered near the doorway with the air of one who belonged to the household, yet was not quite part of the social gathering. His weathered face bore the patient expression of a man who had spent decades tending growing things, though Miss Marple noticed that his usually steady hands showed a slight tremor as he watched Dr. Hartwell prepare for the presentation. "The principles underlying my achievement," Dr. Hartwell continued, his voice growing stronger with enthusiasm, "will revolutionize our understanding of botanical manipulation. What you are about to witness has never before been accomplished in the history of horticulture." As the group moved toward the conservatory, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Miss Pemberton, who seemed lost in thought. The young woman's pallor struck Miss Marple as more pronounced than mere excitement might account for, and there was something in her manner that suggested familiarity with burdens heavier than those typically carried by research assistants. The conservatory itself was a marvel of Victorian engineering, its glass walls and intricate ironwork creating a cathedral-like space filled with the warm, humid air of a tropical paradise. Banks of exotic plants created a riot of color and texture, their various scents mingling into an almost overwhelming perfume that made Miss Marple think of her nephew Raymond's descriptions of foreign markets. At the center of this botanical wonderland stood a single rosebush, carefully isolated on a white draped table. The plant itself appeared ordinary enough, though Miss Marple noted that it seemed to be placed at a considerable distance from the other specimens, as if it required special isolation. "Behold," Dr. Hartwell announced with evident pride, "the world's first true green rose." The bloom was indeed remarkable, its petals displaying a vivid emerald hue that seemed almost to glow in the filtered sunlight. Miss Marple had never seen anything quite like it, though something about the flower's appearance troubled her in a way she could not immediately identify. As the guests gathered closer to examine the extraordinary specimen, Dr. Hartwell launched into a detailed explanation of the breeding techniques and chemical processes that had made his achievement possible. His face flushed with excitement as he described years of painstaking work, though Miss Marple noticed that his breathing seemed somewhat labored. "The secret," he explained, reaching toward the rose with evident pride, "lies in the precise application of specialized compounds that alter the natural pigmentation process while maintaining the structural integrity of the bloom itself." Miss Marple watched as Dr. Hartwell grasped the stem of his prized creation, apparently to demonstrate some particular aspect of its construction. For a moment, his face showed nothing but triumph and satisfaction. Then, quite suddenly, his expression changed to one of startled pain, followed almost immediately by confusion, and then unmistakable alarm. His hand jerked back from the rose as if he had been stung, and he stared at his palm with the bewildered expression of one who cannot quite comprehend what has occurred. "I say," he began, his voice already showing signs of distress, "that's rather odd." His words were cut short as he swayed on his feet, one hand moving to clutch at his chest, while the other remained extended, palm upward, as if seeking help or explanation. Miss Marple, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her years, was the first to reach him as he collapsed. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity as Dr. Haydock, who had been among the invited guests, immediately took charge of the situation. Miss Marple found herself kneeling beside the fallen botanist, noting with growing concern the rapid deterioration in his condition. "Heart attack, I should think," Dr. Haydock muttered, though his expression suggested uncertainty, though the onset was remarkably sudden. As the others gathered in shocked silence, Miss Marple's attention was drawn once again to the green rose, which seemed to her increasingly disturbing eyes to be losing its vibrant color with alarming rapidity. The remarkable emerald hue was fading even as she watched, the petals beginning to curl and brown at their edges, as if the very life was draining from the plant. More troubling still was the behavior of several guests, who seemed more concerned with examining the wilting rose than with the tragedy that had just unfolded before them. Professor Blackwood had moved closer to the plant, his early attention replaced by an expression of keen scientific interest, while Mrs. Fairfax appeared to be making mental notes about the specimen's condition. Miss Pemberton stood frozen near the conservatory entrance, her face white with shock, though whether from witnessing Dr. Hartwell's collapse or from some other cause, Miss Marple could not determine. As Dr. Haydock worked frantically to revive his patient, Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with the methodical attention that had served her well in previous encounters with the unexpected. Something about the entire situation struck her as profoundly wrong, though she could not yet identify the source of her unease. The green rose continued its rapid decline, its impossible beauty fading with each passing moment, as if the death of its creator had somehow severed the connection that had sustained its remarkable existence. Before we continue, I'm your host, Elliot, and welcome to Warm Pages. It's truly beautiful how these stories connect us, no matter where in the world we are. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and if you're enjoying the story so far, feel free to leave a like. It really helps. Now, settle in with your coffee or tea, and let's continue. Chapter 2. Death in the Conservatory. Despite Dr. Haydock's valiant efforts, Dr. Edmund Hartwell passed away within the quarter hour, his final moments marked by the peculiar distress that had characterized his sudden collapse. Miss Marple remained quietly beside the fallen botanist until the end, her sharp eyes noting details that others, in their shock and confusion, might easily have overlooked. Inspector Slack arrived with commendable promptness, his familiar blend of officiousness and barely concealed irritation suggesting that he regarded this latest disruption to his morning routine as a personal affront. Miss Marple had encountered the inspector on previous occasions, and knew him to be a competent, if somewhat rigid officer, whose dedication to procedure occasionally blinded him to subtleties that might prove significant. Natural causes, I should expect, Inspector Slack announced after a cursory examination of the scene. Gentleman of his age, excitement of the moment, probably had a weak heart to begin with. Dr. Haydock, however, appeared less certain of this convenient explanation. Miss Marple observed him examining Dr. Hartwell's hand with particular attention, his medical training evidently detecting something that had escaped the inspector's notice. Slack, Dr. Haydock said quietly. You might want to have a closer look at this. The doctor indicated two small puncture wounds on Dr. Hartwell's palm, barely visible but unmistakably present. They appeared fresh and were positioned precisely where the botanist had grasped the stem of a prized green rose. Thorn pricks, Inspector Slack dismissed with characteristic briskness. Perfectly normal when handling roses, probably what startled him enough to bring on the attack. Miss Marple found herself thinking of a young Tommy Morrison back in St. Mary Mead, who had once insisted that the scratches on his hands came from brambles, when everyone knew perfectly well he had been attempting to climb through Mrs. Pembroke's prize hedge to retrieve his cricket ball. The puncture wounds on Dr. Hartwell's palm had that same deliberate quality, too precise and purposeful to be accidental. Dr. Haydock's expression suggested he shared her reservations. These marks are rather unusual, Inspector. The depth and angle suggest something more than ordinary rose thorns. While the two men debated the significance of the wounds, Miss Marple allowed her attention to wander to the other occupants of the conservatory. The various guests had arranged themselves in small groups, their conversations conducted in the hushed tones appropriate to sudden death, yet she detected undercurrents that seemed inappropriate to the occasion. Miss Pemberton stood apart from the others, her earlier pallor now replaced by a heightened colour that suggested either deep emotion or considerable agitation. She kept glancing toward the laboratory area that adjoined the conservatory, as if concerned about something beyond the immediate tragedy. Professor Blackwood had positioned himself near the dying green rose, his scholarly demeanour barely concealing what appeared to be intense professional interest. Miss Marple was reminded of old Mr. Forsyth, who had been unable to resist examining the contents of his neighbour's greenhouse, even while attending the poor man's funeral. Mrs. Fairfax maintained her elegant composure, though Miss Marple noticed that her attention seemed focused less on the deceased than on the various exotic specimens that filled the conservatory. Her calculating gaze reminded Miss Marple unpleasantly of certain individuals who attended estate sales with purposes far removed from sentiment. Mr. Fletcher, the head gardener, lingered in the background with the patient resignation of one accustomed to crises in the plant world. Yet Miss Marple detected something in his manner that suggested familiarity with the particular dangers that might lurk among botanical specimens. "Inspector," Dr. Haydock continued with growing insistence, "I really must recommend a proper post-mortem examination. The symptoms I observed were not entirely consistent with a simple cardiac episode." Inspector Slack's expression suggested that he regarded such medical precision as an unnecessary complication to what should have been a straightforward case of natural death. However, his years of experience had taught him to respect Dr. Haydock's professional judgment, even when it proved inconvenient. "Very well," he conceded with obvious reluctance, "though I suspect we'll find nothing more sinister than an old man's heart giving out at an unfortunate moment." Miss Marple approached the inspector with the diffident manner that had served her well in previous encounters with official authority. "Inspector Slack, if I might venture a small observation." The inspector's expression indicated his opinion of amateur observations in general, and Miss Marple's contributions in particular, but years of grudging experience had taught him that her seemingly innocent remarks often contained elements worth considering. "The rose itself appears to be dying rather rapidly," Miss Marple continued gently. "I wonder if that might be significant." Indeed, the remarkable green bloom had continued its rapid decline, its extraordinary colour fading to a sickly yellow-brown that bore no resemblance to its earlier magnificence. The petals were curling and dropping with alarming speed, as if the plant were consuming itself from within. "Plants die, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack replied, with barely concealed impatience, "particularly exotic ones that have been subjected to unnatural treatments." Miss Marple nodded agreeably, though she could not shake the feeling that the rose's rapid deterioration was somehow connected to Dr. Hartwell's sudden death. In her experience, such coincidences were rarely as innocent as they appeared. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, had moved to examine the conservatory's laboratory area, which contained an impressive array of chemical apparatus and botanical specimens. His exploration yielded an immediate discovery that changed the complexion of the entire investigation. "Inspector," he called urgently, "you need to see this." The laboratory workbench bore clear evidence of recent activity, with the various chemical compounds and plant materials arranged in a manner suggesting ongoing experimentation. However, what had caught Dr. Haydock's attention was a small vial containing a clear liquid, positioned near apparatus that appeared designed for precise injection. "This equipment," Dr. Haydock explained, "appears to be configured for introducing substances directly into plant tissue. Rather sophisticated work, actually." Inspector Slack examined the apparatus with growing interest. The injection system was indeed complex, incorporating mechanisms that would allow for the precise delivery of chemical compounds through modified plant thorns. "You're suggesting," the inspector said slowly, "that someone deliberately poisoned Dr. Hartwell using his own rose?" Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. "The puncture wounds on his hand are consistent with injection by a hollow thorn. If someone had modified the rose's natural thorns to contain a toxic substance, handling the plant would deliver a lethal dose directly into the bloodstream." Miss Marple found herself thinking of Mrs. Bantry's nephew, who had once attempted to create a practical joke involving a trick flower that squirted water. The principle was essentially the same, though the application here was far more sinister. The revelation that Dr. Hartwell had been murdered transformed the atmosphere in the conservatory entirely. The various guests, who had maintained the polite restraint appropriate to natural death, now regarded each other with the wariness of individuals who realized that one among them was a killer. Inspector Slack immediately ordered that no one should leave the premises, though Miss Marple noted that this instruction was received with varying degrees of concern by the different guests. Miss Pemberton appeared almost relieved, as if the formal constraints of a murder investigation provided welcome structure to her obvious distress. Professor Blackwood's reaction was more complex, combining apparent shock with what Miss Marple recognized as the intellectual excitement of a scholarly mind presented with an intriguing puzzle. Mrs. Fairfax maintained her elegant composure, though her earlier interest in the botanical specimens now took on more troubling implications. Mr. Fletcher's response was perhaps the most telling, as his weathered features reflected not surprise, but rather the grim satisfaction of one whose suspicions had been confirmed. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with the gardener at the earliest opportunity. As Inspector Slack began the formal process of securing the scene and questioning the witnesses, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar nature of the crime they were confronting. The use of the green rose itself as a murder weapon suggested not merely access to sophisticated botanical knowledge, but also a twisted sense of poetic justice that transformed Dr. Hartwell's greatest achievement into the instrument of his destruction. The rapidly deteriorating rose continued to shed its petals, each fallen fragment a reminder that beauty and danger could be inextricably intertwined, and that the pursuit of the impossible sometimes exacted the ultimate price. Chapter 3. The Botanist's Secret Formula. The morning following Dr. Hartwell's tragic demise brought with it the sort of persistent drizzle that seemed particularly suited to murder investigations. Miss Marple reflected as she made her way through the estate's gardens toward the conservatory. Inspector Slack had granted her permission to examine the scene more thoroughly, a concession that spoke more to his grudging respect for her previous assistance than to any enthusiasm for amateur involvement in police matters. Dr. Haydock had spent the early hours conducting his preliminary examination of the deceased botanist, and his findings had proved most illuminating. The toxin that had claimed Dr. Hartwell's life was not merely exotic, but appeared to be derived from the very chemical compound used to create the extraordinary green coloration of his prize rose. Most peculiar business, Dr. Haydock confided to Miss Marple, as they stood in the laboratory section of the conservatory. The poison appears to be concentrated from the same substance that gave the rose its remarkable hue, rather like using a man's own creation to destroy him. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, reminded of poor Mrs. Clement back in St. Mary Mead, whose passion for exotic face powders had ultimately proved her undoing when her jealous sister had substituted arsenic for talcum. There was something particularly cruel about transforming a person's pride into their destruction. The laboratory itself presented a scene of considerable disarray, though whether this was the result of normal scientific activity or deliberate disturbance was difficult to determine. Miss Marple observed that several filing cabinets stood open, their contents scattered in a manner suggesting hasty searching rather than methodical research. The formula, Dr. Haydock continued, appears to have been remarkably complex. From what I can determine from the remaining equipment, Doctor, Hartwell was using chemical compounds that would be extremely dangerous to handle without proper precautions. Indeed, the various apparatus suggested work of considerable sophistication, involving processes that went far beyond ordinary botanical cultivation. Miss Marple noted several pieces of equipment that seemed more suited to industrial chemistry than to the gentle art of flower breeding. Miss Pemberton arrived while they were examining the laboratory, her pale features bearing the strain of a sleepless night. The young woman's distress appeared genuine, though Miss Marple detected an underlying nervousness that suggested concerns beyond simple grief for her employer. Dr. Hartwell's research notes, Miss Pemberton said without preamble, They've been taken. Everything relating to the green rose formula has disappeared. This revelation cast the entire investigation in a more serious light. The theft of scientific research suggested motives that extended beyond personal animosity into realms of commercial or even political significance. "When did you last see the complete files?" Miss Marple inquired gently, employing the same tone she might use when asking Mrs. Price about her missing Sunday collection money. Miss Pemberton's colour heightened slightly. "Yesterday morning, before the presentation. Dr. Hartwell was very particular about keeping the formula secure. He said there were people who would kill for such information." The irony of this statement was not lost on any of them, though Miss Marple noted that Miss Pemberton seemed to realize its significance only after the words were spoken. "What sort of people?" Dr. Haydock pressed, his medical training making him direct in his questioning. Miss Pemberton glanced nervously around the laboratory before answering. Dr. Hartwell had been receiving threatening letters, not just from rival botanists, but from environmental groups who said his work was dangerous and unethical. They claimed he was creating botanical weapons. Miss Marple found this information particularly disturbing, as it suggested that Dr. Hartwell's work had implications far beyond the creation of novelty flowers. The notion of weaponized plants brought to mind the darker possibilities of scientific advancement, when knowledge meant for beauty could be perverted into instruments of harm. "Environmental groups?" Dr. Haydock repeated with evident surprise. "Surely they would be more likely to protest than to resort to violence." Miss Pemberton shook her head. These weren't ordinary conservationists. The letters mentioned specific details about Dr. Hartwell's chemical processes that only someone with advanced scientific knowledge would know. They said his green roses were an abomination that could contaminate entire ecosystems. The examination of the laboratory continued to yield disturbing discoveries. Hidden behind a panel in Dr. Hartwell's desk, Miss Marple found a cache of correspondence that revealed the true scope of interest in the botanist's work. Letters from international collectors offered sums that seemed excessive, even for the most extraordinary botanical specimen. One letter, from a mysterious correspondent identified only as M.F., offered what could only be described as a fortune for exclusive rights to the green rose formula. The language was polite, but carried undertones that Miss Marple recognized from her unfortunate encounter with certain individuals during the business with the missing church silver. Dr. Hartwell was being pressured from multiple directions, Miss Marple observed to Dr. Haydock. Rather like poor Mr. Badger when everyone wanted his prize-winning marrow recipe. Dr. Haydock smiled at the comparison, though his expression remained troubled. The difference being that marrow recipes rarely involve substances capable of killing anyone who touches them. Further investigation revealed that the green rose's beauty had come at a considerable price in terms of safety. The chemical compound responsible for the extraordinary coloration was not merely toxic, but possessed properties that made the entire plant dangerous to handle without extensive protective equipment. Miss Pemberton confirmed that Dr. Hartwell had become increasingly paranoid about security in recent weeks, installing additional locks on the laboratory and restricting access to his research materials. He had also begun wearing gloves when handling his creation, though this precaution had apparently been abandoned during the fatal presentation. He was so excited about showing off his achievement, Miss Pemberton said sadly. I think he forgot how dangerous the plant had become. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose expression suggested that his morning had brought additional complications to an already complex case. The post-mortem confirms poisoning, he announced without preamble. Dr. Haydock was quite right about the delivery method. Someone had modified the rose's thorns to inject a concentrated dose of the same chemical used to create the green coloration. This confirmation transformed speculation into fact, though it raised as many questions as it answered. The precision required to modify plant thorns for poison delivery suggested not merely botanical knowledge but considerable expertise in both chemistry and mechanical engineering. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the various individuals who had been present at the fatal presentation. Each possessed skills that might contribute to such a sophisticated murder method, though the combination of knowledge required seemed almost impossibly broad. The question now, Inspector Slack continued, is who among our suspects had both the opportunity to modify the rose and the knowledge necessary to create such a complex murder weapon. As if summoned by this observation, the conservatory door opened to admit Professor Blackwood, whose distinguished appearance could not entirely mask the signs of a troubled night. His scholarly demeanour seemed more strained than before, as if recent events had challenged assumptions he had long held secure. "Inspector," Professor Blackwood began formally, "I believe there are certain aspects of Dr. Hartwell's work that you should understand before proceeding with your investigation." The gravity of his tone suggested revelations that would further complicate an already intricate case, and Miss Marple settled herself to listen with the patient attention that had served her so well in previous encounters with the darker aspects of human nature. Chapter 4. Whispers at the Flower Show. The Little Wickham Annual Flower Show had proceeded as scheduled, despite the tragic events at Ashford Estate, though the atmosphere among the exhibitors carried an undercurrent of excitement that had little to do with prize dahlias or champion sweet peas. Miss Marple had thought it prudent to attend, reasoning that the botanical community would gather in force, and conversation would flow as freely as the tea being served in the parish hall. She had positioned herself strategically near the refreshment table, having learned long ago that the most illuminating conversations often occurred when people believed themselves to be speaking casually over cucumber sandwiches. The technique had served her admirably during the unfortunate affair of the church organ fund, when Mrs. Dalrymple's indiscreet comments had revealed far more than she had intended about certain irregularities in the accounts. Dr. Hartwell's absence cast a palpable shadow over the proceedings, for he had been expected to present his remarkable green rose as the centerpiece of the exhibition. The empty space where his display should have stood seemed to draw the eye with uncomfortable persistence, rather like the vacant chair at a dinner party following an unexpected death. "Tragic business about poor Hartwell," remarked Mrs. Fielding, the local rose enthusiast, whose own specimens had won numerous awards over the years. "Though I must confess, I always felt there was something rather unnatural about that green rose of his." Miss Marple murmured appropriate sounds of sympathy whilst observing that Mrs. Fielding's expression suggested feelings more complex than simple grief. There was something in the woman's manner that reminded her of Mrs. Bantry's reaction when the vicar's wife had finally admitted that her famous sponge cake recipe relied upon a packet mix rather than traditional methods. "Unnatural in what way?" inquired Colonel Melchett, who had arrived with his wife and was examining the prize vegetables with the thoroughness of a military inspection. Mrs. Fielding lowered her voice in the manner of one sharing confidential information. "The chemical processes involved, Colonel. One heard rumours about the compounds he was using. Quite dangerous, apparently, and not at all in keeping with proper horticultural traditions." Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Fielding's disapproval seemed to extend beyond mere concern for botanical ethics. There was an edge to her criticism that suggested personal grievance, reminiscent of the way Mrs. Hartnell had spoken about the new organist's modern musical arrangements. The conversation was joined by Mr. Petherick, the local solicitor, whose legal mind often provided interesting perspectives on village affairs. "I understand there was considerable commercial interest in Dr. Hartwell's work," he observed carefully. "The sort of sums being discussed were quite extraordinary for a simple flower, however remarkable." This comment drew immediate attention from the surrounding group, for the notion of vast wealth connected to botanical specimens seemed to belong more to adventure novels than to their quiet corner of England. "Professor Blackwood mentioned something of the sort," contributed Mrs. Melchett. "Apparently, there were international collectors willing to pay astronomical amounts for exclusive access to the formula. Miss Marple's ears pricked at this mention of Professor Blackwood, whose scholarly rivalry with Dr. Hartwell had been the subject of considerable speculation in botanical circles. She had observed the professor's behaviour at the fatal presentation, and found his reaction to Dr. Hartwell's death curiously mixed with what appeared to be professional satisfaction. One wonders, she ventured delicately, how such collectors would have learned about Dr. Hartwell's work if he was so secretive about his methods. Mr. Petherick's legal training had taught him to consider such questions seriously. Information of that nature rarely remains completely confidential, Miss Marple. There are always assistants, suppliers, rival researchers who might piece together enough details to attract interested parties. The mention of assistants brought Miss Pemberton to mind, and Miss Marple found herself wondering about the young woman's precise role in Dr. Hartwell's research. There had been something in Miss Pemberton's manner during their recent conversation that suggested knowledge beyond what might be expected of a mere laboratory assistant. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Fairfax, whose elegant appearance drew appreciative glances from the assembled company. Her presence at a village flower show seemed somewhat incongruous, given her obvious wealth and sophisticated manner, rather like finding a rare orchid growing in a cottage garden. "I do hope I'm not intruding," Mrs. Fairfax said with practised charm. "I was so hoping to see Dr. Hartwell's famous green rose, though I understand that circumstances have made that impossible." Her expression of disappointment seemed genuine enough, though Miss Marple detected something in her tone that suggested more than casual interest. It was the same quality she had observed in Mrs. Price's voice when inquiring about the availability of certain valuable items at the church jumble sale. "You knew Dr. Hartwell's work?" inquired Colonel Melchett with military directness. Mrs. Fairfax's smile carried a hint of mystery. "I collect unusual botanical specimens, Colonel. Dr. Hartwell's achievement represented something truly extraordinary in the world of horticulture." Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Fairfax's definition of her interest as collecting seemed rather modest for someone whose correspondence with Dr. Hartwell had involved offers of substantial financial sums. The discrepancy reminded her of Mr. Raphael's tendency to describe his extensive business empire as a few modest investments. The conversation turned to speculation about the future of Dr. Hartwell's research, with various members of the group expressing opinions about whether his work should be continued or abandoned. Mrs. Fielding remained firmly convinced that the entire enterprise had been dangerously misguided, whilst others argued that scientific progress should not be halted by tragedy. "The question," observed Mr. Petherick with legal precision, "is whether Dr. Hartwell's formula died with him, or whether someone else possesses sufficient knowledge to continue the work." This comment produced a moment of thoughtful silence, as if the assembled company had suddenly realized the implications of what had been lost. Miss Marple found herself wondering whether Dr. Hartwell's murderer had been motivated by a desire to obtain his secrets, or by determination to ensure they remained buried with their creator. The afternoon's revelations continued when Mr. Henderson, who maintained the flower show's prize-winning greenhouse, approached their group with obvious excitement. His weathered features bore the expression of one who possessed information of considerable significance. "I've been thinking about that green rose business," he announced without preamble. "Reminded me of something that happened about 3 years ago." The group's attention focused upon him with the intensity usually reserved for the announcement of prize winners, sensing that his observations might prove illuminating. "There was a German fellow," Mr. Henderson continued, "came through these parts during the war, botanist of some sort, though he was doing work for the government. Heard talk that he'd been experimenting with unusual plant modifications." Miss Marple felt a familiar tingle of recognition, the sensation that always accompanied the discovery of a significant piece in life's complex puzzle. The mention of wartime botanical research suggested possibilities far more serious than simple flower breeding. "What sort of modifications?" asked Colonel Melchett, his military background making him particularly alert to such implications. Mr. Henderson's expression grew troubled. "Weaponization, Colonel. Plants that could be used for purposes other than decoration or agriculture." The revelation cast Dr. Hartwell's work in an entirely new and disturbing light, suggesting that his green rose might have been merely the beautiful surface of something far more sinister. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the various individuals who had shown such intense interest in the botanist's formula, and wondering which of them might have understood its true potential. As the afternoon drew to a close and the flower show began its familiar ritual of prize presentations and congratulations, Miss Marple reflected upon the web of connections that seemed to be emerging around Dr. Hartwell's death. The combination of wartime secrets, international collectors, and dangerous botanical research created a pattern that was both fascinating and deeply troubling. She gathered her belongings with the quiet satisfaction of one whose afternoon had proved most instructive, knowing that the seemingly innocent world of flower shows and garden parties often concealed depths that would have surprised those who dismissed village life as uneventful. Chapter 5. The Greenhouse-Keeper's Tale. The following morning found Miss Marple taking her customary constitutional through the grounds of Ashford Estate, having persuaded Lady Ashford that a gentle walk might serve to settle her nerves after the previous day's disturbing revelations. The truth was rather more calculated, for Miss Marple had observed that Mr. Fletcher, the head gardener, began his daily rounds at precisely 7:30, and she was most anxious to speak with him away from the scrutiny of Inspector Slack's official investigation. She discovered him in the kitchen gardens, tending to a bed of early lettuces with the methodical care that spoke of decades devoted to growing things. His weathered hands moved among the young plants with the delicate precision of a surgeon, and Miss Marple was reminded of old faithful in St. Mary Mead, whose gentle manner with plants had always contrasted so remarkably with his gruff treatment of human beings. "Good morning, Mr. Fletcher," she said pleasantly, employing the tone she might use when commenting on the weather to a fellow parishioner after Sunday service. Fletcher straightened slowly, his expression carrying the wary courtesy of one who has learned to be cautious around members of the household. "Morning, miss. Terrible business about Dr. Hartwell." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, noting that Fletcher's hands bore fresh soil stains, but also what appeared to be chemical burns on his fingertips, the sort of marks that might result from handling dangerous substances without adequate protection. "You worked closely with Dr. Hartwell, I understand," she observed gently. "It must have been fascinating to assist with such groundbreaking research." Fletcher's expression darkened perceptibly, and he turned his attention back to the lettuce bed, with movements that suggested suppressed agitation. "Fascinating isn't the word I'd use, miss." The gardener's tone carried undertones that reminded Miss Marple of Dr. Haydock's manner when discussing certain patients whose complaints he suspected were largely imaginary. There was disapproval there, mixed with something that might have been fear or perhaps moral indignation. "The work was dangerous, then?" Miss Marple inquired with the innocent curiosity of one seeking to understand technical matters beyond her comprehension. Fletcher straightened again, this time meeting her gaze directly. "More dangerous than Dr. Hartwell wanted to admit, miss. Those chemicals he was using weren't meant for growing flowers." Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of intuition that always accompanied significant revelations, rather like the sensation of recognizing a half-remembered melody. "What were they meant for, Mr. Fletcher?" The gardener glanced around nervously, ensuring they were quite alone before continuing. "Military applications, miss. Dr. Hartwell, he thought he could adapt them for peaceful purposes, but some things are too dangerous to play with." This confirmation of her growing suspicions settled over Miss Marple like a piece of a puzzle finding its proper place. The wartime botanical research mentioned at the flower show was clearly connected to Dr. Hartley's recent work, though the precise nature of that connection remained to be determined. "You helped him with these experiments?" she asked carefully. Fletcher's hands clenched unconsciously, and Miss Marple observed that his knuckles bore scars that spoke of repeated exposure to caustic substances. "At first, yes. He said he needed someone who understood plant cultivation. But when I realized what those compounds could do—" His voice trailed off, but his expression completed the thought with eloquent distress. Miss Marple was reminded of young Timothy Granton, who had initially been delighted to help with the church fireworks display until he understood the true destructive potential of the materials involved. "What could they do, Mr. Fletcher?" The gardener's response came slowly, as if the words were being drawn from him against his better judgment. "Kill everything they touched, miss. Not just the plants they were meant to affect, but anything that came into contact with them. Dr. Hartwell called it targeted botanical modification, but I knew poison when I saw it." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the same calm attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern, though inwardly she felt a growing sense of alarm. The implications of such substances in the wrong hands were almost too disturbing to contemplate. "Yet you continued to assist him?" Fletcher's expression grew defensive. "I tried to talk him out of it first, miss. But Dr. Hartwell, he was convinced he could control the danger, make it safe for ordinary use, said the benefits to horticulture would be revolutionary." The gardener's account reminded Miss Marple of Dr. Frankenstein's noble intentions in Mrs. Shelley's famous novel, and she reflected that good intentions often proved insufficient protection against the consequences of meddling with forces beyond human control. "When did you realize the true extent of the danger?" Fletcher moved to another section of the garden bed, his movements betraying continued agitation. 3 weeks ago, miss, there was an accident in the laboratory. Just a small spill, but it killed everything in a 6-foot radius within hours. Plants, insects, even the earthworms in the soil. Miss Marple's mind immediately turned to the green rose's rapid deterioration following Dr. Hartwell's death, and she wondered whether the plant's spectacular demise had been the result of its creator's absence or something more sinister. "What did you do about your concerns?" The gardener's hands stilled in their work, and when he looked up, Miss Marple saw the expression of a man carrying a considerable burden of guilt. "I told him I wouldn't help any more, miss. Said he should destroy the whole lot before someone got hurt." "And Dr. Hartwell's response?" Fletcher's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "He said I was being unnecessarily cautious, claimed he had perfected the safety protocols, and that the green rose proved his methods were sound." Miss Marple found herself thinking of the various individuals who had shown such intense interest in Dr. Hartwell's work, and wondering how many of them had understood its true potential for destruction rather than creation. "Did anyone else know about your concerns, Mr. Fletcher?" The gardener hesitated before answering, and Miss Marple sensed that she was approaching information of particular significance. "I spoke to Miss Pemberton about it," he admitted reluctantly. "Thought she might have some influence with Dr. Hartwell, being his assistant and all." This revelation cast Miss Pemberton's behaviour in an entirely new light, suggesting that her nervous demeanour might stem from knowledge of the botanical weapons, rather than simple grief over her employer's death. What was Miss Pemberton's reaction? Fletcher's expression grew troubled. "Strange thing, miss. She didn't seem surprised by what I told her, almost like she already knew how dangerous the work was." Miss Marple filed this observation away for future consideration, noting that Miss Pemberton's role in the laboratory might have been more significant than she had initially indicated. "You mentioned that someone had been accessing the greenhouse at night," Miss Marple continued. "Can you tell me more about that?" Fletcher nodded grimly. "Started about a month ago. Someone with keys had to be because there was no sign of forced entry. But equipment had been moved, experiments disturbed." "Did you report this to Dr. Hartwell?" "I did, miss, but he said I was imagining things. Claimed all his assistants were completely trustworthy." Miss Marple reflected that Dr. Hartwell's faith in his associates had proved tragically misplaced, though whether through naivety or willful blindness remained to be determined. What sort of experiments were being conducted during these nocturnal visits? Fletcher's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The sort that would make the green rose formula look like child's play, miss. Someone was working on concentrated versions of Dr. Hartwell's compounds, making them more potent, more dangerous. The implications of this revelation sent a chill through Miss Marple that had nothing to do with the morning air. The notion that someone had been secretly developing more deadly versions of already dangerous substances suggested purposes far removed from botanical research. Do you have any suspicions about who might have been responsible? Fletcher glanced around once more before answering, and Miss Marple observed that his nervous behaviour suggested fear as much as discretion. I have my suspicions, miss, but proving them is another matter entirely. What I can tell you is that whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing, and they weren't interested in growing flowers. As Miss Marple made her way back toward the house, her mind worked to incorporate Fletcher's revelations into the growing picture of deception and danger that surrounded Dr. Hartwell's death. The gardener's account painted a disturbing portrait of scientific research gone astray, where the pursuit of botanical beauty had wandered into territories that might better have remained unexplored. Chapter 6. A Pattern of Poisoned Petals. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to Inspector Slack's temporary headquarters in the village hall proved most illuminating, though not entirely in the manner she had anticipated. The inspector had arranged his investigation materials with characteristic thoroughness, and among the various documents spread across the trestle tables were several files that immediately caught her attention. "Inspector," she began, with the deferential manner that had served her so well in previous collaborations, "I wonder if you might have discovered any connections between Dr. Hartwell's work and similar research elsewhere." Inspector Slack's expression suggested that he regarded such inquiries as an unnecessary complication to what should have been a straightforward murder investigation. However, his grudging respect for Miss Marple's previous observations had taught him to consider her questions with more care than their innocent phrasing might suggest. "As a matter of fact," he replied with obvious reluctance, "we have uncovered some rather disturbing parallels." He indicated a thin file containing what appeared to be newspaper clippings and official correspondence. Miss Marple observed that the papers bore the distinctive appearance of documents that had been assembled hastily, suggesting recent discoveries rather than long-standing knowledge. Two other botanists, Inspector Slack continued, working on similar projects involving artificially modified plant colours. Both died under circumstances that were initially attributed to natural causes. Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle of recognition that always accompanied the emergence of a significant pattern. In her experience, coincidences of this nature were rarely as innocent as they first appeared, rather like the time when 3 separate households in St. Mary Mead had reported missing silver within the same fortnight. "Where did these deaths occur, Inspector?" Slack consulted his notes with the precision of one who had learned to double-check his facts when Miss Marple was involved. "Dr. Wilhelm Brenner in Switzerland 6 months ago. Professor Henri Dubois in France 3 months past. Both were working on botanical modification projects involving chemical alterations to natural plant pigmentation. The geographical spread of the death suggested coordination rather than coincidence, and Miss Marple found herself thinking of the systematic approach that had characterized the unfortunate business with the missing church silver. Someone with considerable organizational abilities appeared to be eliminating researchers whose work threatened their own interests. What were the official causes of death? Inspector Slack's expression grew increasingly grim as he consulted the files. Dr. Brenner was found dead in his laboratory, apparently from exposure to toxic fumes. Professor Dubois collapsed during a lecture on plant chemistry, presumed heart failure brought on by overwork. Miss Marple reflected that both scenarios bore uncomfortable similarities to Dr. Hartwell's own demise, though the specific methods differed sufficiently to avoid immediate detection of any pattern. Were there any witnesses to suggest otherwise? The inspector's hesitation suggested that this question had touched upon information he would prefer not to discuss. In both cases, there were irregularities that might have warranted further investigation, but local authorities were satisfied with the official explanations. Miss Marple understood that Inspector Slack's diplomatic phrasing concealed what were likely significant oversights by his foreign colleagues, a situation that reminded her of the way Constable Polk had initially dismissed the evidence of tampering with the church collection box. What sort of irregularities? Slack referred once more to his documentation. Dr. Brenner's laboratory showed signs of systematic searching, though nothing was reported missing. Professor Dubois had received anonymous threats regarding the ethical implications of his research, but these were dismissed as the work of environmental extremists. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear, suggesting a coordinated campaign against researchers working in the field of botanical modification. Miss Marple wondered whether the murderer's motives involved eliminating competition or preventing the development of dangerous knowledge. Have you been able to determine who might have known about all three research projects? Inspector Slack's expression indicated that this question had occurred to him as well, though the implications made him uncomfortable. The botanical research community is smaller than one might expect, Miss Marple. Information about significant breakthroughs tends to circulate among specialists. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, reminded of the way gossip travelled through village social circles, carrying information that was often more accurate than official announcements. The murder of three researchers suggested someone with intimate knowledge of current developments in botanical science. Were there any common connections among the victims beyond their research interests? The inspector consulted a different set of papers, his movements betraying the careful attention he now paid to Miss Marple's inquiries. All three had been approached by the same international collecting organization, offering substantial sums for exclusive access to their research. This revelation cast the murders in an entirely new light, suggesting commercial motives rather than scientific rivalry. Miss Marple was reminded of the unfortunate affair involving Mrs. Bantry's valuable jewellery, when competition among potential buyers had led to increasingly desperate measures. What sort of collecting organization? Inspector Slack's response came slowly, as if he were reluctant to voice his suspicions. The correspondence was always signed by representatives rather than principals, but the amount involved suggests resources far beyond those of ordinary botanical enthusiasts. Miss Marple reflected that such elaborate concealment of identity was rarely employed for innocent purposes, much like the anonymous letters that had plagued St. Mary Mead during the regrettable business with the Women's Institute funds. Do you suspect that Dr. Hartwell's murder was connected to these earlier deaths? The inspector's affirmative nod carried the weight of considerable professional concern. The methods were different, but the pattern is unmistakable. Someone has been systematically eliminating researchers who possessed knowledge that someone else wanted to control. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, whose medical expertise had proved invaluable in understanding the sophisticated nature of Dr. Hartwell's murder. His expression suggested that he brought additional information of significance. Inspector, Dr. Haydock began without preamble, I've been corresponding with colleagues in Switzerland and France regarding the deaths you mentioned. The medical evidence suggests all three murders involved plant-based toxins, though different varieties were used in each case. This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion that the murderer possessed extensive knowledge of botanical chemistry, sufficient to select appropriate poisons for each specific victim. Different toxins would make the deaths appear unconnected, she observed thoughtfully. Dr. Haydock nodded approvingly. Precisely, Miss Marple. The use of varied plant-based poisons would prevent investigators from recognizing a pattern, especially if the deaths occurred in different countries. Inspector Slack's expression grew increasingly troubled as the implications became clear. "You're suggesting that we're dealing with someone who has been planning these murders for months, possibly years." The systematic nature of the killings reminded Miss Marple of the methodical approach employed by the individual responsible for the missing archaeological artifacts from the local museum. Such careful planning suggested someone with considerable patience and organizational skills. "The question remains," Dr. Haydock continued, "whether Dr. Hartwell's murderer was working alone or as part of a larger organization." Miss Marple found herself considering the various individuals who had been present at the fatal presentation, wondering which among them possessed the knowledge and resources necessary for such an elaborate scheme. Has anyone traced the source of the botanical toxins used in the earlier murders? Inspector Slack consulted his notes once more. The plants involved were exotic species, not readily available through ordinary channels. Someone with access to specialized botanical collections or research facilities would have been required. The investigation had revealed a web of international connections that extended far beyond the quiet English countryside where Dr. Hartwell had met his end. Miss Marple reflected that murder, like gossip, often travelled further and involved more people than initially appeared possible. As she prepared to leave the village hall, Miss Marple's mind worked to organize the various threads of information into a coherent pattern. The systematic elimination of botanical researchers suggested motives that extended beyond personal animosity into realms of commercial or political significance, where the stakes were high enough to justify multiple murders. The revelation that Dr. Hartwell's death was part of a larger pattern cast all the suspects in a more serious light, for they were dealing not with a crime of passion, but with the calculated work of someone for whom killing had become a professional necessity. Chapter 7. The Hybrid's Deadly Truth. The discovery came quite by accident, as the most significant revelations often do, when Miss Marple was examining the contents of Dr. Hartwell's private study with the methodical attention she might have devoted to organizing the church flower rota. Lady Ashford had granted her permission to review the botanist's personal papers, believing that a fresh perspective might illuminate aspects that had escaped official notice. The study itself bore the comfortable untidiness of a scholarly mind at work, with botanical journals stacked upon every available surface, and research notes scattered with the apparent randomness that often conceals a deeper organizational principle. Miss Marple had encountered similar chaos in the late Canon Pennyfather's study, where apparent disorder had masked a filing system comprehensible only to its creator. It was whilst examining a collection of botanical treatises that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a slim volume bound in faded leather, its German title suggesting origins that predated the current conflict by some considerable margin. The book appeared to have been well used, with numerous annotations in what she recognized as Dr. Hartwell's distinctive handwriting. "Botanische Kriegsführung," she read aloud, her schoolgirl German sufficient to translate the ominous title. Botanical warfare. The implication sent a familiar chill through her sensibilities, rather like the sensation she had experienced upon discovering that Mrs. Spenlow's charitable activities had been motivated by considerably less innocent purposes than advertised. The volume proved to contain detailed descriptions of plant-based chemical weapons developed during the Great War, complete with formulae and application methods that made for deeply disturbing reading. More troubling still were Dr. Hartwell's marginal notes, which suggested not merely academic interest, but active experimentation with the described compounds. Among the papers scattered across the desk, Miss Marple discovered correspondence that cast Dr. Hartwell's recent work in an entirely new and sinister light. The letters, written in a combination of English and German, detailed the acquisition of research materials from what appeared to be wartime sources. One letter, dated barely 3 months previous, bore particular significance. It described the successful procurement of materials from the Brenner collection and referenced completing the work that circumstances prevented during the conflict. Miss Marple sat back in the worn leather chair, her mind working to assemble these revelations into a coherent picture. Dr. Brenner had been the Swiss researcher whose death had formed part of the pattern Inspector Slack had identified. The suggestion that Dr. Hartwell had acquired materials from his research created disturbing implications about the true source of the Green Rose formula. Further investigation of the correspondence revealed references to a doctor, Klaus Brenner, described as a brilliant chemist whose work on botanical applications was terminated by unfortunate circumstances in 1943. The date suggested that this individual might have been a predecessor or perhaps relative of the recently deceased Swiss researcher. The notion that Dr. Hartwell's supposedly revolutionary breakthrough might have been based upon stolen or appropriated wartime research cast his entire enterprise in a fundamentally different light. Miss Marple was reminded of the unfortunate affair involving Colonel Bantry's war medals, when investigation had revealed that his most prized decoration had actually belonged to another soldier entirely. A manila folder concealed beneath a stack of botanical journals contained documents that confirmed her growing suspicions. The papers, some bearing official stamps, and others obviously copied from classified sources, detailed chemical weapons research conducted by German scientists during the closing years of the previous conflict. The formulae described were remarkably similar to those Miss Marple had observed in Dr. Hartwell's laboratory, though the original applications had been decidedly less benign than flower cultivation. The research had focused upon developing compounds that could contaminate agricultural areas, rendering them uninhabitable for extended periods. Miss Marple reflected that the transformation of such destructive knowledge into seemingly innocent botanical research represented a particular form of scientific irony, rather like discovering that Mrs. Weatherby's prize-winning rose fertilizer had been derived from materials of distinctly questionable origin. The study door opened to admit Miss Pemberton, whose pale features showed the strain of recent events. Her surprise at finding Miss Marple among Dr. Hartwell's papers was evident, though it was quickly replaced by an expression that suggested resignation rather than alarm. "You've found the German research, haven't you?" Miss Pemberton said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. Miss Marple nodded gently, employing the same tone she might use when comforting a parishioner burdened by private guilt. "I rather suspect you've known about this for some time." Miss Pemberton moved to the window, her gaze directed toward the conservatory where Dr. Hartwell had met his end. "I discovered the truth about 6 months ago, when I was organizing his research files. The Green Rose formula wasn't his creation at all." The young woman's admission confirmed what the documentary evidence had suggested, though it raised equally troubling questions about her own role in maintaining the deception. "What did you intend to do with this knowledge?" Miss Pemberton's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I planned to expose him, Miss Marple. The work was too dangerous to continue, and the fraud made it even worse. Dr. Hartwell was taking credit for research that had cost lives during the war." Miss Marple observed that Miss Pemberton's moral indignation appeared genuine, though it was complicated by what seemed to be personal guilt about her own involvement in the project. "Did Dr. Hartwell know that you had discovered his deception?" The question prompted a visible struggle in Miss Pemberton's expression, as if she were weighing competing loyalties against the demands of honesty. "He suspected, I think. We had several heated discussions about the ethical implications of the research. I told him the work should be discontinued, that it was too dangerous to continue." Miss Marple reflected that such confrontations often prove catalytic in situations where multiple parties possess dangerous secrets. The combination of scientific fraud, Wartime theft and lethal chemical compounds created circumstances in which desperate measures might appear justified. Were others aware of the formula's true origins? Miss Pemberton hesitated before responding, her manner suggesting knowledge that extended beyond her official role as research assistant. Professor Blackwood knew something was irregular. He had worked with Dr. Brenner before the war and recognized similarities in the chemical approaches. Mrs. Fairfax, too, seemed unusually well informed about the research's background. The revelation that multiple individuals had possessed knowledge of Dr. Hartwell's deception complicated the investigation considerably. Miss Marple found herself considering which among them might have been motivated to commit murder by the combination of scientific fraud and potential weapons development. The night experiments that Mr. Fletcher mentioned, Miss Marple continued carefully, were they attempts to develop more dangerous applications of the formula? Miss Pemberton's affirmative nod carried the weight of considerable distress. Someone was working to concentrate the compounds, making them more potent and longer lasting. The results would have been devastating if released into agricultural areas. The implications of such weaponization sent a chill through Miss Marple that had nothing to do with the study's temperature. The notion that someone had been secretly developing biological weapons using Dr. Hartwell's stolen research suggested motives that extended far beyond personal or commercial interests. As Miss Pemberton departed, leaving Miss Marple alone with the disturbing documentary evidence, the elderly detective reflected upon the web of deception and danger that had surrounded Dr. Hartwell's final achievement. The beautiful green rose had been revealed as a fraud built upon stolen research, while its creator had been eliminated by someone whose own purposes remained alarmingly unclear. Chapter 8: Midnight in the Rose Garden. Miss Marple's announcement at dinner that evening was delivered with the same casual air she might have employed when mentioning a particularly successful batch of preserves at the Women's Institute meeting. The assembled company at Ashford Estate listened with varying degrees of interest as she described her discovery of what she termed certain documents of considerable significance among Dr. Hartwell's effects. "I have arranged to transfer these materials to Inspector Slack tomorrow morning," she continued, observing the faces around the dining table with the peripheral attention she had perfected during countless village gatherings. "No doubt they will prove illuminating to the official investigation." Lady Ashford expressed appropriate gratitude for Miss Marple's assistance, though her manner suggested the polite bewilderment of one whose peaceful existence had been disrupted by events beyond her comprehension. The other dinner guests received the announcement with reactions that Miss Marple filed away for future consideration. Professor Blackwood's scholarly features betrayed a flicker of what might have been alarm, quickly suppressed beneath his customary academic composure. Mrs. Fairfax maintained her elegant poise, though Miss Marple detected a sharpening of attention that reminded her of Mrs. Hartnell's expression when particularly choice gossip was being shared at the parish tea. Miss Pemberton, who had joined them for dinner despite her obvious distress over recent events, appeared almost relieved by the announcement, as if the prospect of official scrutiny provided welcome resolution to a burden she had carried too long alone. Following dinner, Miss Marple retired to her chambers with expressions of gentle fatigue, though her actual intention was quite different from the peaceful night's rest she had announced. Experience had taught her that significant announcements often prompted revealing nocturnal activities, much as the news of Mrs. Spenlow's impending departure from St. Mary Mead had triggered a remarkable series of midnight visits to various parish properties. She positioned herself at the window of her first-floor room, which commanded an excellent view of the conservatory and the adjacent rose gardens. The moon was nearly full, providing sufficient illumination to observe movement without the need for artificial light that might betray her vigil. The estate settled into the quiet rhythms of night, with only the occasional sound of settling timbers or distant owl calls to break the silence. Miss Marple maintained her patient watch with the same assistance she had once employed, when attempting to identify the individual responsible for the mysterious nocturnal rearrangement of the church hymnal collection. Shortly before midnight, her vigilance was rewarded by the appearance of a shadowy figure moving with obvious purpose toward the conservatory. The individual carried what appeared to be a small lantern, its light carefully shielded to prevent detection from the main house. Miss Marple observed the figure's approach with growing interest, noting the confident manner in which they navigated the garden paths and manipulated what were clearly keys to the conservatory's entrance. This was someone thoroughly familiar with the estate's layout and security arrangements. Once inside the glass structure, the intruder's activities became partially visible through the transparent walls. They appeared to be searching methodically through the laboratory area, their movements suggesting familiarity with the location of specific materials. Miss Marple had taken the precaution of alerting Inspector Slack to her suspicions earlier in the evening, though she had phrased her concerns in terms of general security rather than specific expectations. The inspector had arranged for discreet surveillance of the conservatory, positioning himself and Constable Lake in locations that would allow them to apprehend anyone attempting unauthorized access. The trap was sprung with the efficient precision that characterized Inspector Slack's better moments. The intruder, absorbed in a search of the laboratory equipment, failed to notice the careful approach of the two officers until escape was no longer possible. The confrontation that followed was brief but revealing, as the would-be thief's initial attempts at innocent explanation quickly gave way to desperate justification of their presence. Miss Marple observed from her window as the scene unfolded, noting details that would prove significant to her growing understanding of the case. The identity of the midnight visitor came as less of a surprise than it might have done earlier in the investigation, for Miss Marple's methodical consideration of motives and opportunities had gradually eliminated other possibilities. What proved more illuminating was the individual's reaction to capture, which suggested desperation rather than mere opportunism. Inspector Slack's interrogation, conducted in the conservatory, with the evidence of the intrusion readily apparent, began to unravel a web of deception that extended far beyond simple botanical research. The captured individual's initial denials gave way to increasingly elaborate explanations that revealed knowledge far exceeding what their official role would have suggested. Miss Marple descended from her room to join the confrontation, her presence apparently expected by Inspector Slack, who had learned to value her insights during the complex unraveling of criminal enterprises. The midnight intruder's reaction to her arrival suggested recognition of her reputation for penetrating deception. "The documents you claim to have found," the captured individual began with obvious agitation. "They could expose research that extends far beyond Dr. Hartwell's work." Miss Marple nodded gently, employing the encouraging tone she might use when coaxing a reluctant parishioner to admit their involvement in the church fund's discrepancy. "Indeed, the implications are quite extensive. Perhaps you would care to explain your own connection to these broader concerns." The question prompted a visible struggle between self-preservation and the need to justify actions that had escalated far beyond their original scope. Miss Marple observed that the individual's distress appeared genuine, suggesting involvement motivated by something more complex than simple greed. "The formula was never meant for botanical applications," came the eventual admission. "Dr. Hartwell's theft of the German research was just the beginning. There were others working to develop the compounds for purposes that would have horrified him." Inspector Slack's expression indicated that this revelation aligned with his own growing suspicions about the international scope of the investigation. The systematic elimination of botanical researchers had suggested coordination that extended beyond individual criminal enterprise. "You killed Dr. Hartwell to prevent this development?" Miss Marple inquired, with the same gentle persistence she might employ when questioning a child about broken crockery. The response came with the weight of moral conviction, though it was complicated by obvious regret for the methods employed. He was going to sell the formula to the highest bidder, regardless of their intentions. The potential for mass destruction was too great to allow commercial exploitation. Miss Marple reflected that noble motivations had provided justification for numerous crimes throughout history, though they rarely absolved the perpetrators of responsibility for their chosen methods. The individual before them had clearly struggled with competing loyalties, much as young Roger Bassington French had, when faced with choosing between family obligation and moral principle. As Inspector Slack continued his methodical questioning, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge, revealing connections that extended across national boundaries and involved individuals whose true allegiances remained carefully concealed. The midnight confrontation in the Rose Garden had exposed not merely a single murderer, but the existence of a network dedicated to controlling research that could reshape the nature of warfare itself. Chapter 9. The Final Cultivation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the conservatory as Miss Marple settled herself in the wrought iron chair that Inspector Slack had thoughtfully provided for her comfort during the final interrogation. The events of the previous evening had stripped away the last vestiges of pretense, and she found herself facing Miss Pemberton across the small table with the same gentle directness she might employ when discussing parish matters with a troubled parishioner. Miss Pemberton's composure had finally cracked entirely, a carefully maintained facade of innocent grief replaced by the haggard appearance of one whose burden of secrets had become too heavy to bear. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed upon the spot where Dr. Hartwell's prized green rose had once bloomed in its deadly splendor. "I suppose you have known for some time," Miss Pemberton said quietly, her voice carrying the weary resignation of one who has finally abandoned the effort to maintain deception. Miss Marple inclined her head with the same gentle understanding she had shown to Mrs. Clement when that poor woman had finally confessed to the irregularities in the church flower fund. "The signs were rather evident once one understood what to look for, my dear." Inspector Slack positioned himself near the laboratory equipment, his notebook at the ready, though his expression suggested that he found Miss Marple's methods of eliciting confession both mysterious and remarkably effective. The formal caution had been delivered, but the atmosphere was more reminiscent of a drawing-room conversation than a police interrogation. "It was the manner of your reaction to Dr. Hartwell's collapse that first caught my attention," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "You displayed not shock, but rather the guilty relief of one whose desperate plan had succeeded beyond expectation." Miss Pemberton's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I never intended for it to happen during the presentation. The timing was purely coincidental. I had prepared the modified rose the previous evening, expecting him to handle it during his morning routine." Miss Marple reflected that the most carefully planned crimes often succeeded through accident rather than design, much as Mrs. Bantry's attempt to catch the individual stealing her prized delphiniums had resulted in the unexpected exposure of the much more serious matter of the missing war memorial funds. "You had discovered not only that Dr. Hartwell's formula was stolen from wartime research, but that he was planning to sell it to parties whose intentions were decidedly less than benevolent." The accusation prompted a flash of defensive anger in Miss Pemberton's eyes. "He called them commercial interests, but I knew better. The correspondence I intercepted made their true purposes quite clear. They weren't interested in creating beautiful flowers." Miss Marple nodded with the sympathetic understanding of one who had witnessed the corruption of noble intentions by human greed. "You were working as an agent for some government organization, I presume, tasked with monitoring Dr. Hartwell's research and preventing dangerous knowledge from falling into inappropriate hands." Miss Pemberton's slight nod confirmed what Miss Marple's careful observation had suggested. The young woman's nervous competence, her unusual familiarity with complex chemical processes, and her access to information beyond what a simple research assistant might possess had all pointed toward a more significant role than she had claimed. "The Special Operations Executive recruited me 3 years ago," Miss Pemberton admitted, her voice gaining strength as she abandoned the pretense that had sustained her deception. "My assignment was to monitor botanical research that might have military applications." Inspector Slack's expression indicated his surprise at this revelation, though Miss Marple had suspected some form of official involvement from the systematic nature of the investigation into multiple researchers across different countries. "Dr. Hartwell was not your first target," Miss Marple observed with the same gentle persistence she might use when encouraging a reluctant witness to complete their testimony. Miss Pemberton's confession came with the relief of one finally unburdening herself of secrets too heavy to carry alone. Dr. Brenner, in Switzerland, Professor Dubois in France, both were developing botanical weapons based on stolen German research. Both refused to discontinue their work despite official warnings. The revelation cast the previous murders in an entirely different light, transforming what had appeared to be commercial assassination into something more resembling sanctioned elimination of dangerous research. Miss Marple was reminded of the complex moral calculations that had characterized the recent global conflict, where noble ends had often required questionable means. Yet Dr. Hartwell's case was different, Miss Marple continued thoughtfully. He was not developing weapons himself, but rather enabling others to do so through his fraudulent research. Miss Pemberton's expression reflected the moral complexity that had driven her to murder. The buyers he was negotiating with included representatives of hostile governments. The formula, combined with the manufacturing processes he had stolen, would have allowed mass production of biological weapons. Miss Marple reflected that the transformation of Dr. Hartwell's beautiful green rose into an instrument of international espionage represented a particularly modern form of corruption, where scientific achievement became subordinated to political necessity. The other deaths were accomplished using different methods to avoid detection of a pattern, she observed. But Dr. Hartwell's murder required something more poetic, more personally satisfying. Miss Pemberton's slight smile held no warmth whatsoever. He was so proud of his green rose, so convinced of his own genius. Using his own creation to destroy him seemed appropriate justice for his theft and fraud. Inspector Slack cleared his throat meaningfully, apparently feeling that the conversation had strayed too far from official procedure. "Miss Pemberton, you are confessing to the premeditated murder of Dr. Edmund Hartwell, as well as to the murders of Dr. Brenner and Professor Dubois." The formal question prompted a moment of hesitation, as if Miss Pemberton were weighing her loyalties against the demands of legal accountability. When she finally responded, her voice carried the conviction of one who believed her actions had been justified by circumstances. "I am confessing to eliminate